Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is your host, Sam Terode, and today I'm honored to be speaking with Victoria Browning Wyeth. Victoria is the only granddaughter of painter Andrew Wyeth. Her great-grandfather, Nc Wyeth, and uncle, Jamie Wyeth, are also renowned American artists. Victoria studied the history of psychiatry at Harvard and earned her master's degree in psychology from Wesleyan University. While working in psychology, Victoria has lectured at Wyeth exhibits from Paris to Tokyo and frequently leads gallery talks at the Brandywine River Museum in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, and the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. Victoria has curated art shows and exhibited her own photography. A book of her photographs and accompanying essays, titled My Andy, was published by the Greenville Museum of Art. In this interview, Victoria shares many insights and stories from her amazing family. I don't know if it's possible, but I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Victoria. How are you? I know normally you'd be doing gallery talks right now at the Farnsworth or the Brandywine River Museum. So how have you been doing during the pandemic?
Actually, one of the silver linings, I'm a big runner, and I always used to run inside, and it was always a fight my grandfather and I would get into. He's like, if you're running inside, you can't see anything. I'm like, I don't want to see anything. I just want to run. So I started, when all the gyms shut down, I started running outside. And so I do these awesome 8-mile runs now through Philadelphia, which I just love. So it's one of the silver linings. And, I didn't even know what Zoom was until, the pandemic. And my best friend, David, his stepmom, called me up and she's like, oh my God, you should do a Zoom lecture on your grandfather for my retirement community. I'm like, I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous. And obviously I had to call her back and apologize and tell her she was very, very smart to suggest that. So for me, the Zoom is great because I'm able to reach nursing homes and schools and kids that I never would have been able to lecture to otherwise.
Wow, that's great. I hadn't heard of Zoom either.
Yes, I had no idea what it was.
Well, that's exciting that you're able to perhaps be doing even more lectures than before, reaching new audiences.
Yes, definitely.
Well, even before we get into your amazing family, I was interested. I picked up my copy of My Andy, which is your book of photographs.
How did you get that? It's out of print.
I ordered it, I think, when it came out about 3 years ago.
Ah, okay.
I own almost every book about Andrew Wyeth or related to the Wyeth family. So when a new one comes out, I jump on it. But I was looking at your biography in the back, and I was surprised to see that you had studied the history of psychiatry and psychology. I wondered how you got drawn to that field.
Sure. So I always loved psychology. And when I was in college, I'm not a religious person, but I was at Dunkin' Donuts and these two nuns were there and they were talking to me. I'm like, who do you work for? They're like, they're like him, like who's him, So anyway, so I started volunteering with them at a clothing shelter, and a lot of people came in that were mentally ill. And so I was really intrigued by that. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do for graduate school. So I applied to Harvard as it's called a visiting graduate student. And I got in for 2 years in arts and sciences. And I was really interested in psych, so I took a bunch of psych classes, but I found this discipline called the history of science. And I had never thought about the history of science, like what's the context in which discoveries are made. And instead of just looking at like the great discoverers and the great discoveries, look at the ones that kind of screwed up along the way that helped us get to that. And I just thought it was really interesting. So I was there and I met this professor while I was at Harvard that was visiting from Wesleyan. And she said, hey, if you come to Wesleyan, we will give you free tuition and you have to teach undergraduate students. And by the way, there's a mental hospital next door. And I'm really interested in 19th century psychiatry. It's like, done. So I showed up, and I think it was my second day of Wesleyan. I went to this hospital. It's called Connecticut Valley Hospital. And I went in and I found these case history books from the 19th century. And I got really interested, and they're called delusions. They're false beliefs. So I looked at the delusions of the first couple thousand patients from 1866 to like 1886. My cutoff was like Freud and psychoanalysis. I'm not really, I always hate theoretical stuff. So I looked at the content.
That's great. Well, you could do a lot with delusions right now with QAnon and all this stuff going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's something in psychiatry, it's called folie deux, and it's basically like the madness of two. So let's say I'm mentally ill and I have this delusion of like infestation, that there are bugs everywhere. And you are my husband and you're a little screwy and, we get married and you move in with me, you kind of catch the delusion, right? But if they take you away from me, you'll get better. So a lot of the what I'm seeing with QAnon and so forth, it reminds me very much of like a shared delusion. And you listen to, I'm a huge fan of, I love The Daily, the New York Times podcast, and I was listening to this person and they were talking about, conspiracy theories and the person that's hosting it said, what's your evidence? Well, I need evidence that it's wrong. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, so it's something. It's a hell of a world we're living through.
Yeah. One of my main interests is Ralph Waldo Emerson. I've written some books about his philosophy. So I was just curious if you had studied him. I'm at least imagine you've run across his godson, William James.
Well, so yes, I've read both. I remember reading Walden Pond when I was in college. So, I don't know much about either. As I said, when I was doing my research, I was really interested in kind of how delusions looked in the case histories and then how that compared to the primary source literature. So literally I would lock myself in the library and read, it's called the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, the American Journal of Insanity. And I would just read thousands and thousands of articles and kind of look. So if I had a delusion in my master's thesis, I would give, 5 or 6 footnotes for kind of parallel academic articles. So
that's great. One of my favorite things is when one of my favorite people in history was connected to another. So I was remembering how Nc Wyeth was a great fan of Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, which you just referenced. And he was deeply influenced by the Transcendentalists. So I thought that would be a good starting point if you could talk some about your great-grandfather, Nc Wyeth.
Sure. So the first thing, I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know a lot about Nc because he was killed in 1945, and my grandfather talked about him, as I'm going to explain in a second, but he really talked about him as like an artistic influence and inspiration. There are obviously lots of books on my great-grandfather. However, I don't like reading books on my family. I feel that, and people can please feel free to disagree with me, I feel like it taints my perception. And, my knowledge is so pure. Everything I got is from my grandfather and from my uncle. I feel like if I start reading books, my brain won't be able to distinguish, well, what's from the book and what's from, Andy, and so forth. And honestly, this is where I'm going to come across as a snob. I don't care what someone else thinks my grandfather or great-grandfather thought. Even my grandmother wrote this wonderful book. It's called The Wyeths, and it's all these letters about my great-grandfather, but she edited it. And so it's only a snippet of the letter, and a good historian wants to see the whole letter. Like, what's left out? Why was that left out? Why was it not put in? So I don't know much about his views on Thoreau, his opinions of Thoreau. I know he's a huge Thoreau fan. I know he freaked out when Andy was born on Thoreau's birthday on July 12th. That was like a big...
Wow, I wasn't even aware of that.
Yes.
That's
so
amazing.
That was, my great-grandfather was, to the moon. He was so excited about that. So about Nc, he was very tough, and my grandfather always said that he was really kind of this drill sergeant in terms of, paint, 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 focus, 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 and paint what you know. And there's always this kind of story in the family that Nc would always say, if you're painting something, you think it's great, turn around. Because you're probably so fixated on what you're painting that you've missed something so fabulous behind you. So that would be number one. Number two, I'm really a big lover of my grandfather and my uncle's pictures, but I'm best friends with my ex-husband, Alan, and Alan is just obsessed with my great-grandfather's work, and he's like, oh my God, how can you not love this? I'm like, well, it's kind of violent and intense. And he's like, but the wind, and you can feel, the movement. and so forth. But it just doesn't, I think his ability to depict, scenes is incredible. I think the way that NC would be given a manuscript for, let's say, Kidnapped or Treasure Island, and he would have total discretion as to what he wanted to paint. I think that's incredible. That he could, and there's this wonderful one called Blind Pew from Treasure Island. It's about this, basically the villain is this guy, Blind Pew, and there's a scene when he gets run over and killed, but NC chose to illustrate the moment right before, which I think many illustrators wouldn't do. They would pick that kind of scene when he's, crushed and, and the carriage rolls on and so forth. So I think it's that moment of him kind of tapping down the road, which I think is really great. So my grandfather just talked about how he always said, paint what you know, paint what's in your heart, paint with emotion, paint with intensity, which I think is really wonderful.
Wow. Nc Wyeth, I would say his reputation has grown over time. He certainly hasn't been forgotten. I think people love and admire his illustrations and paintings more than ever.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, he and Howard Pyle are just, they're unbelievable. And I was in the Brandywine recently with my boyfriend, because he doesn't know a lot about art. So I was taking him through, and when you really get in close and you look at the fine-grained details of NC's work, it really is incredible. But as I said, I didn't know him. And so I don't have the attachment to his work that I do with Andy and my uncle, because, my uncle, Jamie, if I have a question, I just call him up and he explains it. Or, I'll be giving a lecture and, he'll call me and he's like, hey, I've got this new painting, throw it in the lecture, and he'll email it to me. Andy would take me around and introduce me to these people. And he wouldn't say, these are my models. He would say, this is my friend, Anna, or this is my friend, Andy Bell, and so forth. And it's really amazing when you finally are old enough to realize, holy shit, that the people that I've been hanging out with and the places I've been going are the people and places in his paintings. That's a big thing for a young woman to kind of realize. All my babysitters were his models, and then, now I'm constantly seeking out models that I've never met. And so I was interviewing this woman, Shirley Russell in Maine, and there was this painting of her called The Rebel from the 70s, and she's in her early 20s. And I knocked, she said, sure, come on in. And I knocked on the door and she opened the door. And it was like, I don't know if you've ever read A Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's about this guy that sells his soul to the devil so that he doesn't age, but his painting ages. You've got to read it. It's great. And so basically she opens the door and it's like a painting is aged, 40 years in front of me. And I saw her big blue eyes. I'm like, oh, that's her, but it's a trip. So.
Wow. I'm fascinated with how Nc Wyeth raised his children all to be so creative in different ways. The oldest daughter, Carolyn, was a painter. Henriette was a wonderful painter. Anne was a composer. Nathaniel became an important engineer for DuPont, which is kind of the outlier of the family. The one who's not an artist goes off and becomes a great engineer.
We always knew Nat was different, ever since he was actually named NC, and they changed his name because he couldn't paint, which must have, been very tough. But, Andy would tell me these stories about how when he was a little boy, Nat would sit there and talk about how much time you spent blinking, in your life, and would do some sort of math equation. And that's, Andy said we knew he was just different, Carolyn and Andy were very similar. They had these kind of wild, crazy, fun personalities, and Nat and Anne were kind of more quiet. I didn't know Henriette, unfortunately, at all. I think I met her only a couple of times because she was in New Mexico. But Nat and Anne were just kind of very sweet and quiet, and Carolyn, she was just full of hell. She was so much fun, as was Andy. And I think that's something people don't understand. I think they look at Andy's pictures and they think that he was this kind of boring, crusty old guy, and he was totally full of hell. And NC was incredible. The way he raised those kids with art and literature and music, it's a shame now I see people put their kids in front of video games for 7 or 8 hours. Like hell, I would never allow that in my house. Books, no way, no video games. I don't think so.
It's definitely a struggle with kids today.
Too bad. You got to lay down the law.
Yeah. You talked about Nc's influence on Andrew, who was the youngest of the family. And they also clashed as Andrew was becoming older. His style was different from what Nc wanted at times.
I don't think Nc quite understood that Andy's genius lay in his simplicity. And so there's this wonderful early drawing where Nc said, I want you to draw kind of action and motion in the woods. And so Andy drew these Native Americans kind of sitting there with this incredible detail in the trees and the bark. And then Nc said, no, no, no. And Nc showed them kind of running through the forest with spears. And, there's this wonderful painting Andy did, I think it was in 1944 or 43, it's called Turkey Pond, of his friend, Walt Anderson, walking through the grass in Maine. And Nc said, he needs to be holding a gun or something. And Andy said, no, Pa, this is what I want. And of course, 4 years later, in 1948, it would be one girl in a field. That would change the way that we look at art. Of course, Christina's world. Now, unfortunately, Nc never lived to see that. But I think as Nc kind of approached his death, he started to understand what a genius Andy was. I mean, Andy was selling out his shows, but he always said, you need more color, you need more, more, more. But what's interesting is, Nc was this kind of drill sergeant, and he died. And, and my grandfather married my grandmother before Nc passed. And so he just kind of swapped one for the other, because my grandmother was also very tough on my grandfather. And Nc, who wanted more, Betsy would say, no, simplify, no, take that out, and it's funny, I started this journal about my grandfather when I was 14, and I was looking at it the other day, and I said to my boyfriend, like, why the hell did I write this? What prompted me to sit here and take notes? I'm happy I did, but there's so many examples where, Andrew would bring a painting home, and my grandmother would say, take her out. She's too much, take that out. We need more of this. And it's like his father.
Wow. Your story about taking elements out of a painting reminds me of one I saw in the Brandywine Museum, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. It was a tree, and there was a African-American woman inside the tree. And then a couple of years later, I returned, and the woman had been painted out.
Right. So the painting was called Dryad, Dryad. I think it was 2001. And it's this woman, Senna Moore. And my grandmother, she said, take her out. And so first, it was really funny because I showed up at the house, and she had this like strange dark stripe across her abdominal cavity. And I said, what are you doing? And my grandmother always had this stupid line. She'd say, children should be seen but not heard, which is like ridiculous. So she, said that and looked at me. I'm like, okay, fine, I get it, shut up. And then I came back, I don't know, like a couple weeks later, and she's gone. And, and Andy, I remember he looked at me and he's like, we got to get the other ones out, or she's going to make me take her out of the others too. And the funny thing is, though, with tempera, I think it's called pentimento, and it's basically like the artist's mistake. It's very difficult to remove something, so you can still see her kind of coming through. He did it again in 1944 in a picture called Christmas Morning of his friend Hannah Sanderson. So his friend's mom had died, and so my grandfather went to see her, dead, and did this picture of her, and she's watching her son walk away. But my grandmother felt that the son was too much, too cheesy. So Betsy made Andy take him out. But Andy always said, he's coming back. So because you're spending months and months and months putting something in a tempera, you have to spend months and months and months taking it out, which you're not going to do. So that's what you can see. It's what's so cool about his egg temperas. If you really look, you'll see his mistakes. Whether it's like he did this one trodden weed of his boots walking, and you can see where he made the boots a little wide and then kind of brought them in. You just have to know what you're looking for. And most people don't really look that closely, unfortunately, at paintings, which is a shame.
It's interesting to me how he had these great extremes in his style, where he would do tightly controlled, very detailed temper paintings, and then just incredibly splashy, messy watercolors.
So I would say the watercolors are very much Andy, and I think the temperas are very much my grandmother.
Oh, wow. So her influence.
Yes, huge influence. There's a video you should link to your podcast. When my grandmother died, I did this video for the Brandywine River Museum. And I mean, I really talk about the influence she had on his life. I mean, I don't know if I think I saw a wedding ring, so you must be married. And I don't know if your partner or, your spouse, it's amazing. You move in with someone, what they do to the house. And, my ex-husband and I always joke about how we're both only children. And so it's one of the reasons we got divorced. He's like, well, I want this. I'm like, no, it's going to be this way. And it obviously didn't work out. It's better as friends. But it's, my grandmother took over the house, made everything very simple. And, it was very uncomfortable as a young girl. There's no comfy furniture, no squishy couch, and it was just, but it's very much, like living in a Wyeth painting,
Interesting. I was reading a little about your grandmother, Betsy Wyeth, and I found that she had grown up in the Roycroft craft area in East Aurora, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a strong interest for many years in Elbert Hubbard,
mm-hmm.
who started the Roycroft. I've edited a book of his writings. So I thought that was fascinating that she had this connection to Elbert Hubbard and the Roycroft.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So my great-grandfather, Betsy's dad, Merle James, we call him Pom Pom, was the editor of this newspaper and would let my grandmother pick out the front page for Sundays, the photos. And she said she really learned a lot from that, because what he would do is he'd give her all these photos, sometimes of terrible car accidents, all these different things. And she'd lay them all out on the ground and pick which one was the most appealing. So even as a very young girl, she was really kind of developing that aesthetic muscle that would, of course, serve her very well when she married Andrew Wyeth.
Well, Andrew and Betsy spent most of their lives in just two locations, Chadds Pennsylvania, and then in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
It's very unusual for someone to stay so close to their roots. And
see, it's funny you say that, because for me, it's funny to not stay in one place. So I grew up being, taught, you stay where your roots are. I can hear my dad saying, that's where your roots are. I grew up in New York City, but then, I went to college in Maine, lived in Maine, with my dad for a long time. And it seemed totally natural that I would come to Chadds Ford. And I can't imagine leaving. It snowed the other day, and I was driving around with my boyfriend, and I said, I feel like I'm in one of his paintings. And it's just, I can't imagine living in Texas or, and I'm not even, I really hate traveling. I can't stand it, because it's just everything I want is right here. I just feel so happy there. So for me, it was totally normal. We'd go to Maine in the summer, and we'd stay, June through like October, and then, spend the year I was in New York, or in Pennsylvania.
My first experience with Andrew Wyeth was when I was about 17 years old. I was going to do a painting of my high school crush, Carrie Cullen. So I went to the library looking through all the painting books for inspiration. And I came across a book of Andrew Wyeth portraits, and it just blew me away. Nothing resonates with me in my soul the way your grandfather's paintings do. And then after college, I just happened to land my first job in Wilmington, Delaware. So I was living in Pennsylvania, right across the border, just about 10 minutes from Chadds Ford. And I would go to the Brandywine River Museum every weekend. And eventually I had a mutual friend with your grandfather, John Silvassi, who was on the board of the Christian Sanderson Museum. And through John, I was able to meet your grandfather. And
oh yeah, what was it like?
It was amazing. They say not to meet your heroes, but Andy was everything I could have hoped, and very kind and generous, and that very mischievous sparkle in his eye.
So cute. It's funny. One of his models told me that she was a huge fan of his, but she didn't want to meet him. And I said, why? And she said, because I was so afraid he'd be an asshole. And that, I didn't want it to ruin his paintings. And so she finally met him, and she realized he was not an asshole. He was actually a wonderful person. But he had that little twinkle in his eye. He was so cute. I know if he was, I'm sure he must have loved you. I see you have a big dimple. He must have loved your dimple. He loved little things like that.
Well, he did comment on my bright eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I remember that really, I felt amazing that he would compliment me in that way. But so I was living near Chadds Ford, and unfortunately I quit that job and moved to Chicago after only a year. I've always looked back on that as, what a regret that I didn't spend more time in that area.
You can always come back.
Yeah. And I have come and visited Chad's Ford multiple times since then. And that's where probably around 2012 I was there, and I was able to be in a tour group that you were leading.
Oh, wow. What color was my hair?
Blonde, I think.
Blonde, yeah, short, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's how I can always tell what year people come to the tour. What was my hair? Was it like short and spiky or long?
So I can understand the attraction of Chad's Ford.
Yeah.
You've got a Hank's Place poster behind you.
I do. So I actually live in Philadelphia. I lived in Chad's Ford for a bit. And it was a little too Wyethy for me, you know, and I like diversity, of which Chad's Ford, unfortunately, is not very diverse. But I love Philly. You know, no one knows who my family is, or if they do, they don't care. And I love it. You know, I love all the different people. I love the sirens. I feel like I'm never alone. You know, every time I see a cockroach, I just kind of giggle. And so.
Do you think Chad's Ford will stay separate, or do you worry about it being kind of overtaken by Philadelphia, becoming a suburb?
No, I think it'll stay separate. A good friend of ours, his name was Frolic Weymouth, who is the chairman of the board of the museum, has the Brandywine Conservancy, and so many people have donated their land, which ensures that it won't be built up. So I don't worry about that.
That's great. One time when I was at the Brandywine Museum, I overheard a woman looking at one of Andrew's paintings and saying, "Oh, this is so realistic, it looks just like a photo." And so I wanted to grab her and say, "It's nothing like a photo. Look at the perspective is going this way and that. There's no way a camera could do that." And how things will be an incredible focus and detail in the foreground, and then a blade of grass a mile away will be in focus. So I wondered what you think of sort of the mislabeling of Andrew Wyeth as a realist.
So the first thing is I screwed up when I was younger, and I told him his paintings look like photos, and he flipped out. So, you know, he's like, "Why would you say that? I don't use photos." I said, "I didn't say you use photos. I said it looks like a photo." And he was so pissed off. So he and I were inseparable, but we definitely, I'm very opinionated, and there is not a lot of pause between when a thought comes in my head and when it exits my mouth. So there was lots of interesting conversations between he and I. He taught me, he said, "I'm not a realist, I'm an abstractionist." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You're not abstract." I'm like, "Come on, it's not Pollock and it was crazy." He said, No. He said, "It's the shape. The shape comes first." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, first the emotion, right? So I have an emotion." I said, "Well, what's your emotion?" Every emotion's different, you know? So first he has the emotion, then he sees the shape, and then the rest kind of comes into play. And for example, he did this painting called Otherworld of my grandmother on the inside of a private jet. And I said, "Well, how is that abstract?" And I'll never forget, he sat down and he drew a seatbelt buckle. And he said, "The whole painting is about the shape of the buckle." I said, "That buckle is the size of my pinky nail. This is like a 5-foot painting." He said, "I was going to the John," which happens a lot when you're an older man. And he said, "And I just kept looking at that seatbelt buckle. And I thought, that's how I'm going to start the picture." And, you know, it's incredible. So yes, so he always said he's an abstractionist, not a realist, not a photorealist, you know. But come on, let's be honest. His paintings are so realistic. I believe that one of the things that makes him so appealing is this hyper realism that people forget they're looking at a painting. And he's such an emotional guy, and he feels emotions so intensely, and he has this incredible ability to communicate what he sees to like perfection to every grass blade, and to communicate what he feels so that we feel it, you know. And what I love is that people either love his work and they're crying, or they hate him, which I think is fabulous. You know, that people get so pissed off, this sucks, this guy is you know, illustrator. Great. I love that they hate him because he's creating a reaction, and that's just fabulous. So good.
When you go to Chad's Ford and see some of the scenes, or to Maine, I haven't spent so much time there, you see how much he changes the landscape in his paintings. And
totally. Yeah.
It's incredible. Do you know whether he used photo references at all, or?
So this was like a big argument he and I always got in. "I don't use photos." I'm like, "Okay, fine." So one day after he died, a friend of ours, our caretaker, Bill Stewart, sold these photos. And I was so pissed off because it said, Bill, this is the perspective I want you to take. And it was for that painting, Other World, from the jet. And so he set Bill up in a plane to get an aerial perspective. And I thought, why did you tell me all these years you didn't work from photos? So that's the only time that I know that he worked from photos. So he always said, I don't work from photos and I don't use masking fluid on my white of the paper, you know. And unfortunately, there was a little fib about that too, because there are lots of places where I can see he used masking fluid. So it's always interesting, you know, what did he want me to tell people versus what was reality? So.
Yeah. And I can see, looking at an aerial shot of the mill house and the farm, how a photo would be helpful, but
yeah, but you know, he did Soaring of the giant turkey buzzard in '44, and he didn't have a camera for that, so should have gone up there in the plane and figured it out. So, but anyway,
I've read that he did quite a bit of painting from memory, which amazes me, because how can you have such a vivid imagination and memory as to be able to paint it?
Because you're painting the same places and the same people over and over and over. I mean, you know, it's funny, like when you say a question like that, I feel like these filing cabinets kind of whoosh open in my brain. So, I mean, I can think of numerous times, like he did one called Shellback of his best friend, Walt Anderson, 20 years after he died, you know, lying in this open grave. He painted Snow Hill in 1989. Of all his models, you know, dancing on the maypole, and many of them had been killed, you know, died, you know, and so forth. And so, you know, and he's constantly modifying the environment, taking out technology, taking out a window, but you have to know where he's painting so well to really see what he's changing. I'm surprised, you know, it's interesting because he's painted his friends dead and so forth. I don't know why he didn't paint his dad dead, you know, years later, because he always said that was my biggest regret. I never painted my father after, you know, while he was alive. Well, clearly you had the ability to paint him from memory. Why didn't you? So when he died, I sat in my house, Sam, and I was so pissed off. I had all these questions I wanted to ask, and he was gone, and I couldn't ask them. And so, you know, it is what it is. But boy, I was that mad.
Do you think that he put his memories and emotions of NC into some of his landscapes rather than doing a portrait of him?
I mean, that's definitely one perspective. I tend to stay away from the symbolic references, you know, when you know, when it comes to his work. I know that, like, for example, like winter 1946, it was this young man, Alan Lynch, running down the hill, and everyone says, oh, it's symbolic of NC and the tracks running down the picture because NC was killed in a car accident involving a train. And my grandfather said, no, you know, I painted tracks in my pictures long before Pa's death. But there was a painting he did, I think it was in like the 90s, like the 80s or 90s at the Kerner farm, where he talked about painting train tracks and thinking of his father. But I mean, you know, this is where I get into trouble with people, because unless he said to me, I was thinking of my dad here, I'm not going to say it, you know. And I got into this argument with my uncle once, and he said, you need to talk about symbolism more. And I said, no. And he said, but that's what people want to hear. And I said, I don't care what they want to hear. Great. You know, that's too bad. You know, let them go see a different lecture. But that's not what Andy wanted. He didn't want me talking about symbolism. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, but that's just not the way he wanted me to stick to kind of this idea of, you know, that he paints his life, who the people are, these incredible emotional connections he had to the people and the places. So.
You said that Andy started with emotion with each painting. I think that's why I connect so much with his work, and obviously millions of other people do as well, and why it resonates so strongly with me. There are lots of great realist artists out there, lots of people with amazing technique, but there's such powerful emotion.
There is. You know, I couldn't stand his work when I was younger. I thought it was so boring. You know, I'm like, oh my God, how many times can you paint a tree or a leaf? And then I remember when I started lecturing on it when I was like 15 or 16, I didn't understand. I saw people crying in front of the pictures. And as I got older, I really started to understand the profound emotions that were evoked by his pictures. And, you know, as I got older and had more experiences and lost friends and family members and, you know, everything just kind of crystallized. You know, I used to get dragged to Maine in the summer, and I couldn't stand it. I didn't have any friends. I didn't have a car, and I was so bored. And now I love it. I'll just stay at our family place and just sit inside and read all day. Don't want to leave, just staring out the window at the snow, or, just at the wind. And it's interesting what happens as we get older, how we appreciate things differently.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a quote from your grandfather where he said that he could suggest the idea of war, I think, in a falling leaf, or maybe it was death in a falling leaf. So there's Andy speaking to symbolism.
Definitely. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of examples of, symbolic content in his work, but that's just not really the way he trained me. He just wanted it to be simple. So The idea for me is just to explain, as I said, just the connection he has to these places, that a leaf is not just a leaf. It's a leaf from a tree that he started hanging out against as a young boy.
And then some of my favorite Wyeth paintings are very surreal. I was thinking of the painting Spring, after Carl Kerner had passed on.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Andy's close friend, and he's in a snowbank in the middle of a field, and the snow is melting and his body's in that bank.
It's interesting how that happened. So Carl was dying of cancer, and my grandfather said, I'm going to sketch him. And I said, why would you paint someone that's dying? He said, we all process death differently. So he's painting Carl, who's, lying down, and he's in these white sheets. So you see how he made the jump from the sheets to the snow. And, so Andy's drawing him, and one day, he's doing all these drawings of Carl in bed, and you see out the window, you see Kerner Hill, that hill that you see in Spring. And then all of a sudden, one day in one of the drawings, you just see my grandfather totally kind of move outside of the window, and he just does this abstract shape of the hill. And that's when he kind of takes Carl and transports him outside. And, it's such a weird painting, but I never questioned it. And I never thought to say, well, what are you doing? Why would you put this guy out there? And he'd always say, I thought, here's Carl, and he's, been dead all winter, and spring's coming. So he's kind of thawing out. And again, this was just normal, this kind of weird stuff. And I was like, sure, why not, But for me, it was really just this idea of, watching his friend die, not knowing how to cope with it, and painting him. There's another one that was done right after that called Nightcap of Anna Kerner. And it's so sad because she just looks so sad, so melancholy. And she's obviously watching her husband die. And I think one of the things that people don't think about is how these individuals, his friends, allow him in their house when they're dying to really capture these very private moments. And, I watched my grandfather die, and I wouldn't have shared that with anyone, obviously my family, but, some strange artist, no way, So it's really incredible that he's allowed to document these things. And it's not just the Kerners. I mean, he had this wonderful friend, Adam Johnson, and Adam's wife, Etta, was riddled with brain tumors, and Andy was asked to go in and draw her. So pretty incredible, the friendships he had.
It's amazing being in that circumstance that he would be able to draw. Something that I think if I was in that situation, drawing would be the last thing on my mind.
I thought that too, but when Andy died, I called my dad and my uncle, and I said, you gotta, he passed away. And, my dad came down, and then Jamie came down, and I think the hospice nurse thought we were just crazy because we put candles, and Jamie was just sitting there drawing his dad in bed, dead, and I remember I was videotaping and taking pictures because I had never lost someone that was that close to me, and I just couldn't process what was going on. So I just thought, okay, I'm just going to document this. I'm really happy I did.
It's a testament to just how much artists they are at their core, Andy and Jamie.
Incredible.
And I know that there are some quotes from Andrew that I've seen where he talked about wanting to disappear himself and just observe.
Yeah. He always said, I want to be invisible. And that's what he is now. I mean, wherever he is, he's invisible. I'm not a big believer in the afterlife, but sometimes I hope so much that wherever he is, that he could just paint and observe and do whatever it is he wants, and has as many leaves and snowfalls as he wants.
Yeah. I guess my belief would be that consciousness can't be destroyed. It merges back in with the universal consciousness. So I think Andy has certainly gotten his desire right now of being pure consciousness. I have this idea that Andrew Wyeth was a Zen master, an American Zen master, because instead of meditating all day, he was painting and drawing, and he was so connected to the patterns of nature that they just flowed out of his hand. I don't think it was possible for him to draw or paint a bad leaf.
Oh, no, I disagree. There was plenty of botched paintings. I mean, we just don't show them, or he'd burn them. You know, I mean, he was not perfect. He would screw up lots of times. And also, he would do an insane amount of preliminary studies. I was talking to my ex-husband about this last night for dinner. We were hanging out, and I said, I remember when I started working at the Brandywine in 2004, and Jamie came into my office, and my uncle said, what are those? I'm like, oh, they're binders of his paintings. And he said, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you know, I'm trying to teach myself about, you know, how he did the work. And so there's a binder for the studies for raccoon, for roasted chestnuts. And Jamie pulled it out, and he could not believe how many drawings there were. 50, 60, 70 studies sometimes. And I mean, so Andy starts, he has a kernel of what he wants, but he starts with so much, and then he does these drawings, and they help him to simplify and take things out. Now, you know, every Monday I work with, it's called his catalog resume. It's an unpublished, basically, book of everything he's done. And, you know, and yesterday I was looking at this drawing he did. It's called a painting. It's called Malmut, of these two German shepherds at Kerner's. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm looking at the studies, I'm like, you should have kept that tree in, you know, and sometimes I think he simplified too much. But I think that there are many examples of him screwing up. We just don't show them.
Well, I think that's a good correction. Perhaps I tend to think of him in a nearly superhuman way.
No, you can't do that. No way. Not at all. He is not. He is just like everyone else. He puts his pants on at the end. I mean, he had this incredible talent. But look, he'd get pissed off. He'd a temper just like everyone else. He could be a pain in the ass just like everyone else, you know, as can I. You know, I mean, he was human.
But his dedication to the craft and being prolific for so many years, that's what makes me think of a Zen master.
Yes. There were not enough hours in the day for him. And, you know, I think that he was a bit bothered by the summer. I think in his perfect world, it would just be winter, fall, all year.
That, I wonder, is it just the certain way he was wired? What makes for a person to be that dedicated to their craft?
He just loved it. He loved it. You know, I think when you find something you really love, that's all you want to do. My boss is 99, and his name is Dr. Aaron Beck, and he discovered something in the 40s called cognitive behavioral therapy. And he is still writing. He is still publishing. And I have never met anyone besides my grandfather and Dr. Beck that has that desire to just publish, to work. And, you know, I think for some people, if you stop working, that's when you kind of die. And, you know, I believe that with my grandfather when he started getting sick and he couldn't paint. That's it. You just kind of give up. It's like, what else is there to live for?
I think with people like Willie Nelson, too, another person I admire, I think it's that way that music keeps them alive.
I'm sure.
Well, we've talked a little about your uncle, Jamie Wyeth. I don't know as much about his life and career, but I've been to the Brandywine Museum, I've seen his works from the 60s and 70s, and he seemed to have more of a style influenced by his father. And then
and grandfather too. I'd say Jamie is heavily influenced by Nc Wyeth, which is interesting because they never met. These big puffy clouds, these very much action scenes of birds. I mean, and Jamie's character, the people in his pictures, they're screaming and yelling, and I mean, really. Whereas Andy's animals are like dead, you know, on the side of the road, or you know, it's like a dog basking in sunlight. But Jamie takes. You know, he's got his father's technical ability, but he's got Nc's eyes and imagination. So he's kind of got the best of both worlds.
Wow. With his works from the 1990s onward, that's where I feel like he really has come into his own. He's found his own unique style and voice, using a lot of thick oil paint, bright colors, and
color, yeah.
Mixed media with chalk and paint combined.
Pearls, all sorts of stuff. I mean, he'll paint with everything, sticks, stones, he'll just incorporate it right into the composition. No rules.
Wow. Yeah, there's a video of him painting somewhere on YouTube.
Inferno. Yeah, it's called Inferno.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I don't know how to describe it. It's like a chaos, but then something amazing comes out of it.
He is incredible, and he loves to walk. I am a massive athlete. I run, I lift weights. And my uncle, who's born in 1946, who's quite a bit older than we took this walk. I mean, he was walking straight up. I mean, like literally, this hill was just literally up and down. And Jamie just charged forward. And, I wonder, where does he get all these ideas? But he's taking these massive walks on Monhegan and through Wilmington, Delaware. And he's just such an acute observer of life, just like his father. But the things that Jamie sees are just so different. Andy's interested in, the animal and, being dead and, decaying and the light. Jamie's interested not just in the visual of the animal, what it sounds like, what it looks like, how does it, behave, everything. I've never seen someone pay such attention to seagulls in all my life. A lot of people just paint the seagull. Jamie's looking at, how it looks at its feet, how it mates, how it eats, it just everything. It's unbelievable. He is something else.
Yeah, he has a series of paintings that I was able to see in person called The Seven Deadly Sins.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And could you explain what that series is?
Sure. So Jamie was good friends with this gentleman, Lincoln Kirstein, who is a very prominent figure in the ballet scene in New York City. So Lincoln Kirstein's brother-in-law is an artist, Paul Cadmus. And Paul Cadmus had done these very kind of homoerotic Seven Deadly Sin pictures. So Jamie would go to Kirstein's house and he'd see these sins on the wall. So it's always in his kind of subconscious. So one day, my uncle, Jamie's a massive dreamer. I should tell you, like Daddy, my Uncle Jamie, Andy, and myself, we're all just massive, massive dreamers. And Daddy doesn't really do this. I don't think Andy did, but I write down my dreams and Jamie paints them. So Jamie wakes up and he says, well, he's dreaming about the seven deadly sins, but he thought, well, why not have it with seagulls? And he has a notebook, next to his bed, and he writes it down. And it's almost like, he said, it's like hieroglyphics. And it takes him a little bit to kind of decipher what the hell it is he wrote. So he thought, well, why not have the seagulls acting out the seven deadly sins? So he did greed, sloth, pride, envy, lust. And he said, if you ever see seagulls engaging in sex, in coitus, it is a very violent thing with feathers flying and, and he really just got into it. And I think that the timing was perfect for him to do the seven deadly sins because he knew the seagulls so well. And only when you know something that intimately can you do something like the seven deadly sins. I mean, if you have another artist that just knows how to paint seagulls, it wouldn't work. You have to really intimately know them.
Yeah.
Like I remember, I love ice cream. It's probably why I like to run so much. It allows me to eat more. But I went to my uncle's house constantly searching for sweets. And I opened the freezer. I'm like, oh, great. There's a dead bird in the freezer. In the freezer, there's a dead seagull. And, I was like, oh, my God, you got to be kidding me. But it should come as no surprise. I mean, I remember snuggling with my grandfather in the studio and you hear, thump, and I said, what was that? Oh, can you be a dear and go get that little bird that just died? And I'd have to get it and wrap it up and put it in the fridge. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. But it works. These guys, they are in their own planet, but it works beautifully. It's really, really cool. And, my favorite thing about my uncle, he sends me letters with drawings on them. And there's this one I love so much. So Jamie unfortunately lost his wife about a year or so ago. And so it was 2 years anyway. And so he did this watercolor and it says, Vic, dear, this is basically where I am at night at 5:00. And he's walking through the fields with his dogs, and then you turn it over and there's another watercolor and it's him visiting his where his wife is buried. And it's just so profound. and so deep. And so I remember when I saw it, I just started sobbing. I mean, it's really, he's just awesome. 2016, I had breast cancer, and I remember when the doctor told me, I didn't know, I couldn't call my parents. Like, I don't know how do you tell your parents you have cancer. And so my uncle is probably the most stable person I know. So I called Jamie from the bathroom crying, and I was like, I have cancer. No, you're fine. I'm like, no, I'm not fine. I have this massive tumor. And so when they said I'm going to do all this treatment, I called Jamie. I said, can you please send me a pink ribbon? And so what he did, it was really cool. He did this painting for me, and it says, my family calls me Vic. So it's a Vic in pink breast cancer letters, but if you look really closely, it spells out victory. And that was like a really neat thing, because, when you have cancer, you're so scared you're going to die. And so I looked at that every morning, and I would go for my run and exercise, and then I'd go to cancer treatment. And he was just, his attitude and his ability to kind of infuse that attitude in his work is really amazing.
Great that he has this strong connection with you. I think sometimes I have the impression that like Andrew Wyeth and Jamie Wyeth, they're just painting all the time. They don't have time for personal relationships.
No, we're a family.
Yeah.
My grandmother, she died in April, and the last 5 years, it's a really small family. It's just Daddy and Jamie, and, it's my grandmother and I. And so I taught myself to cook, the last 5 years. And so Jamie and I would have dinner every Sunday with my grandma. He'd come over, and we'd have these big family dinners, and we'd light candles. I would do Thanksgiving, I would do Christmas, I would do Easter, and we'd all just sit around like a big family and just shoot the shit and have these awesome meals. And I would send Jamie home with little doggy bags, and and unfortunately I would put it in the car sometimes, and his dog would eat it before Jamie would get to it. But he just a normal, loving family. Yeah. I mean, usually if I call my uncle, it's about 6 o'clock in the morning, just to check in and say hi and I love you, and just tell him how much I love him. He doesn't have kids. And so I feel like, I try as hard as I can to kind of be a surrogate daughter to him.
Well, it's great that you made it through the cancer. How is your health these days?
It's good. I have an oncology checkup in 2 hours, which is always terrifying. It's really scary, but, stay positive. And if I get sick again, I'm going to go into it strong as hell. I'll be a beast. And so I always tell my mom, cancer picked the wrong girl to screw with. And, if something should happen and God forbid I die, what a great life I've had. I have no regrets. I mean, I have the most wonderful friends. I have the most wonderful family. The career I've had and continue to have is just, it's unbelievable. And, for someone that's going to be 42 years old, the good thing about having cancer is it kind of wakes you up and makes you cherish every moment. And so when I run through Philly and I'm tired or hungry, I think to myself, well, this really means I'm alive. And, and I feel so fortunate to kind of have woken up and realize that I am alive, and I'm hopefully going to be here for a long, long time.
That's great. Well, your book, My Andy, your book of photographs, that really brings together your family and a lot of your life. Could you talk about that book and what led to it?
Sure. So for my grandfather's 100th birthday, I was contacted by the Greenville County Museum of Art in South Carolina. They have a huge collection of his work. And they knew that I took a lot of photographs of my grandfather. I'm severely learning disabled. And so I was excused from foreign languages in high school. And so they said, well, you can take studio art or photography. And I said, I'm not painting, I have no talent. But I'll take black and white photos. And I have just thousands and thousands of photos. So the museum said, let's do a big exhibition of your photos. And you write the catalog. And it was so hard to write it. But I just sat down one day at, on our island in Maine, and I just did it. I just wrote it. And I kind of just felt like, when I wrote the catalog, I was like, it's almost like I'm talking to my grandfather. And so that's what I did. I tried to write the way I speak. So, personality.
That's great. I loved the book.
Thanks. Yeah, it sold out. We were really happy.
Do you plan to do more photography projects in the future?
Yes, but I don't plan on sharing them. I really did not enjoy sharing my work with people. I had a gallery show and I felt like a prostitute, people sitting there. How much is this? Why did you do this? I felt like saying, you don't deserve to have this, so I do take photos, but I just do it for my friends. And, it's such a personal thing. I don't know how people sell their art for a living, and I don't care if people like it or if they don't. I like it. And so that's what I do.
Great. Do you think Andy and Jamie, do they distance themselves from the business side of things?
So Betsy, really, my grandma was the business sense, with Andy. Jamie, no, Jamie runs his own show. And I mean, he is, that's what makes my uncle so unique. I mean, he's this great painter, he's this very shrewd businessman, and I don't know how he does it, but he does it. The hell of a family to come from, Sam.
Well, Victoria, it's been so wonderful talking with you. I'm grateful for your time, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for listening to Living from the Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, subscribe, and review. This is an ad-free podcast brought to you by my books, which are available at samterode.com. The theme music was created by Gideon Terode.